Hi, my name is Lindsay Mason, and I'm going to discuss an observation that I completed for INTR 331. I observed a social services setting of a 12-minute pre-recorded video of a deaf counselor, a hard of hearing client, and an interpreter in a vocational rehabilitation setting. I viewed the pre-recorded video there was an interpreter bio, the actual meeting, and then the interpreter reflection. All participants were white and in their 40s approximately. There were two women. One was deaf and was the VR counselor, and the other was a hard of hearing participant who was the client. The interpreter was male and he was a CODA. He is a CODA. He went to school to become an interpreter and is NICS certified, and he is also certified in the state of Utah. He has interpreted since 1999 in educational and freelance settings, and for the last 2 years he's worked in this VR setting. A little bit about the hard of hearing client consumer. She started losing her hearing at age 14, so she was not born deaf, and she received hearing aids at age 23. And her hearing is slowly declining. She is about at a 30 to 25% speech discrimination, and then the mild loss of the low tones. She does use a hearing aid called a Phonic Nadia number 4, and the hearing aid does have a built-in FM system, but it does not have the Icon Bluetooth capabilities. She has no family history of hearing loss. And the setting was all participants were sitting, and it appeared to be a break room. It had a microwave and a whiteboard, and the interpreter was sitting next to the deaf client to the left, and then the interpreter was sitting next to the hard of hearing client, and right across the table was the deaf counselor. And I didn't have full access to the whole scene due to it being a pre-recorded video, and it was a picture-in-picture, so it had up-close pictures of the deaf counselor and then the hard of hearing consumer and the interpreter. And so I didn't get a full view, but I used what I could and worked with that. My first DC CRD, the demand was the deaf VR counselor was signing. This was a very significant, I believe, demand because the interpreter had to think of the extra challenge of having a deaf and hard of hearing, a deaf counselor, and a hard of hearing client. So the interpreter interpreted CI and used his peripheral vision to watch the deaf VR counselor signing while facing more towards the hard of hearing client. The concurrent demands. Client was hard of hearing and needed to read the interpreter's lips. So he was facing her, but still watching the signing from the deaf counselor simultaneously. Also in the reflection video, the interpreter did mention eye gaze in this unique situation, and it was very salient that it was somewhat of a challenge to watch both at the same time. As compared to if it was a hearing consumer, he could be directly looking at the deaf counselor signing because he wouldn't need to be talking and having his lips be accessible to the consumer. But since the consumer was hard of hearing, he had to be facing her in order to interpret simultaneously. That's what he had to do. Another concurrent demand is the hard of hearing client previously said in the conversation that she couldn't work at a hair salon anymore because she couldn't see the mouthing of her customers when she was behind them cutting their hair. She couldn't see the customers talking, and so she could not hear them well enough to read their lips. So we know that she does need to read lips of someone that she's having a conversation with, which is why the interpreter most likely made that control choice of facing her while watching the deaf consumer. I believe this was an effective control choice. it gave communication for both access for both parties to receive the message and for the interpreter to see the communication, the language coming in. It appears that the hard of hearing consumer doesn't know sign language, but we can't make that assumption because I'll talk about it down in the resulting demand that the hard of hearing client did look over at the deaf counselor at times. But I'll talk about that in a minute here. And I just think it's also really crucial that the interpreter body shifts toward her and clearly mouths, as that's really important for her to receive the message clearly and have the English word showing up on his lips. A positive consequence, the hard of hearing consumer has access to read the interpreter's lips. Negative is a decreased eye contact for each consumer. Since he wasn't fully having eye contact when relaying the message verbally to the hard of hearing consumer, because he was looking still at signing or the signing of the deaf counselor. So he didn't have 100% of eye contact and full attention to each consumer. Whereas during assignment control, I'll speak about if he did consecutive interpretation, he would have more of that eye contact. The resulting demand I discussed, the hard of hearing client looked at the deaf counselor when she was signing. So she didn't always rely on the interpreter. She did watch the deaf counselor a couple times. So that was one of the resulting demands. And alternate controls, a pre-assignment control was that they could have met prior to the meeting and asked if they would like more eye contact and use consecutive interpretation to give full attention to each party. They could have asked if they were arranged at that table appropriately or what they prefer, and that's something that they could have already happened. And I think those would be highly effective because it would gain trust in the consumers and open communication to say what they need, or during the interpretation, if something came up, they would have more, I believe, more trust in asking, feeling more comfortable and speaking up about that. And I think it would be would decrease confusions or any skewed messages in the interpretation. During assignment controls, like I said, consecutive interpretation, it would provide a longer meeting. A prolonged meeting would be an effective part of that. But at the same time, it'd be effective as well because it gave more attention and eye contact to each party. However, I do believe his control choice was effective in the situation of using simultaneous and watching both parties. Another during assignment control, maybe he could move into a CI-SI blend, especially if the content was complex or rich. He could go back between the two of them. That's another option that he could have done. Post-assignment is maybe meeting after the meeting and decide if clarification was needed, if she was able to read his lips in all parts, if he read in the message clearly. Another thing is, I'm not sure, since he worked at that VR services, if he had a prior relationship to that, working with that VR counselor, which I mentioned this in my questions that I would have for the interpreter, my interview questions that I'll submit in written form, but I did ask him if he had a previous relationship of working with that deaf counselor, and also if he interpreted for other deaf and hard of hearing consumers that came in as clients. My second DCC-RD, the demand is the counselor asked the client, "Are you working right now?" The interpreter asked for clarification during this question. Some concurrent demands, the deaf counselor changes topics that had a similar question. The topic changed from, so what happened is the deaf counselor said, they were just talking about hearing aids. and specific questions to the hearing aid. And then, although she did, I went back and she did say now as a discourse marker for transition. It was very quickly. And she said, now, you working right now, like again, she signed now twice. And so it could be assumed maybe the interpreter wanted to just clarify that it was talking, she was asking about a job, or if the hearing aids were working properly. And that's really, really salient information, pertinent information, because she's there to find a job. And so figuring out if she had a current job was very important. And her hearing aids, if she was asking that questions, and making sure that they worked. The effectiveness, I think it's highly effective because it decreased confusion, and he just clarified the situation, and especially since that information was very salient. A positive consequence, it provided clarification and a clear interpretation. A negative consequence, the deaf or the hard of hearing client didn't have immediate access to communication. Alternate control choice for that is he could have SimCommed and said the clarification question. So the hard of hearing, or sorry, the deaf counselor knew, the hard of hearing client knew what he was asking for clarifying. And the resulting demand is that it did seem to me that the hard of hearing client was a little confused of what he was saying or asking for clarification. A resolution came next, but the resolution of him getting the clarification and then repeating it to the hard of hearing client. But a resulting demand was that the hard of hearing client did look a little bit confused, appeared that she was confused, just from her facial expressions, that what he was saying to the deaf counselor. Alternate controls, the pre-assignment control, was to predict that, of course, that a job question would be coming up in that meeting. So he would be predicting that that would come up. So would that make more sense that that would be the next question? But again, I think his control choice was the most effective in the situation. During assignment, he could have paid more attention to the discourse marker that she did use for transition. Again, it was a very fast transition, and since they were really focused on the hearing aid, he did say now and then asked the question again and said now again. So, and then post assignment is again, maybe at the end, just making sure that her hearing aid did work properly. I know that wasn't the question, but just that's a salient thing to understand and know, which I think all those would be effective, but I really do think his control choice of asking for clarification was effective, even though most effective in the situation, even though it did not give immediate access to communication and it prolonged the meeting, but it's important to have clarification, especially with that information. My third constellation demand constellation, since I included the first two in the DCC-RD, the demand was the hard of hearing client said black run, and the control choice was the interpreter said he signed say black run, it means slope, and he used the classifier B as a steep slope, and he was actually laughing before he even interpreted that. And the previously in that conversation, the hard of hearing client already compared her hearing loss to a classic ski slope loss and did use some movement showing that. And she showed what tones are on each level of that slope, which tones were a little bit better and a little bit less. And he clarifies the term, excuse me. Another concurrent demand is that the deaf counselor may not be familiar with that term, and we are unaware exactly where she's from or where they are in. I assume it's in Utah, which makes sense because it is a ski state as far as I'm aware. And the deaf counselor informs that after this comment that she is an avid skier as well and is familiar with that regional term coming from Utah. So we didn't know that at the beginning before he made that control choice, but after that, she did say that she was an avid skier. And another concurrent demand is that the term diamond, like a black diamond run, wasn't included, and that may be a more familiar phrase and wouldn't need the the expansion. So the control was that the interpreter expanded on what that meant. I believe that's very effective because he wasn't aware of where the VR counselor is from, at least from our perspective. He may have, of course, if he's been working with her, but we don't know, and so we can assume that maybe he didn't, which is kind of unlikely. But so just giving that short expansion was effective, I believe. Also, I think it was the only part that was a little less effective is that the interpreter laughs himself before he signed Black Slope or interpreted that phrase at all or the expansion. And so I think that was a little bit confusing, maybe because it was kind of giving his own personal experience because he thought that was funny, but that's not what the deaf counselor was. She wasn't laughing because she didn't know what was said yet. Pre-assignment control. I thought maybe they could review the audiogram. I don't know if that was possible. I believe they were going to set up an appointment to review the audiogram or at least get that paperwork. And so if that would be a control option, I'm not sure how important that is in this situation about finding a job, but it could be. And I think that might be an effective control choice because then they could really see the comparison that they were talking about with the black run comparing to her hearing loss. During assignment control was just could be just do fingerspell black run instead of signing it, and then just say no, it's a ski slope type. That's very steep. It's another way of saying it. He could have fingerspelled it, and that's it. And see if the deaf counselor understood, watched her back channeling, if she laughed, if she did a head nod, which in this case she probably would have because she did. The resulting demand is that she did say that she was an avid skier. So I believe that would have been an effective one too. Even though I do think it was such a short expansion, I do think that was the most effective, the one that he did. And a post-assignment control is that he could have clarified the comparison after the meeting. And I think she is going to bring her audiogram in, and they can clarify that more next meeting. And I think that's effective as well. But again, I think the interpreter's original control choice is what would be most effective besides laughing first. I think that was just kind of going out of the interpreter role, which I know we don't always like to say, but in this case, I think it's okay. So my conclusion. So for our observations, I did do 3 other live observations. This was the first pre-recorded one I did for this class for our individual observations. And even though it's pre-recorded, it gave me a great perspective, especially since nowadays in the COVID world that a lot of things are more electronic and remote and over different platforms online. And it just gave me some more perspective and demand and control options that I could explore. And I'm happy I got to see another VR setting. I've never had the opportunity to observe one live. And I think this will really help for my upcoming VR observations and assignments. I feel like I'll be better prepared and seeing some of the common demands that may come up, especially related to the VR questions and content terminology that they use. And I'm extremely grateful to have the opportunity to view this video, as I didn't know it was a deaf counselor and a hard of hearing client before I chose this video, and I was considering it, and decided I wanted to do it. And then, of course, found out right away that it was that extra challenge of not having a hearing consumer. So being able to shift, and so both parties could have access to the communication, and just that extra layer I haven't observed live or in a class, over a video or anything, in this unique situation of having a deaf counselor and a hard of hearing consumer in the same interpretation setting. And yeah, like I said, just the demographics of those um, consumers and the language requirements was just really great to see the different comparisons and what to do in that situation, and what this interpreter did in this situation. And I look forward to submitting my questions and having that perspective of being able to go back and ask those questions, um, as related to a live interpretation, and being able to meet with the interpreter. Even though I can't meet with this interpreter because it's a pre-recorded video, I can take those questions, similar questions that may come up in VR settings, to my future observations and assignments in VR settings. Thank you so much.